Hello everyone, I'm Sketchup, and welcome to Dungeon Wright. This episode is the second part of my double episode about building a fantasy city. In the previous one, I showed you how I create a city map, a top-down view, and in this one I will show you how I designed a three-dimensional illustration of the same city. Again, this is somewhat of an advanced tutorial, but if you have any questions or would like me to elaborate on a specific topic raised in this tutorial, feel free to ask me questions in the comments below. Before we start, I would like to touch briefly upon what I will call the final words of an alchemist's law, saying, "A little experimentation never killed anyone." Experimenting is part of growing as a creator, using your skill set to do things you haven't done before, and trying to figure out how you can translate your techniques in this new challenge. In this episode, you will see me creating a three-dimensional city for the first time, and the different techniques I experimented with in the process. So let's kick this tutorial off where we got into a fork in the road in our last episode, and get to three-dimensional drawing straight away. After making the first sketch of my city, I always get into drawing a second, more detailed sketch first. This is part of my search in trying to figure out what the city will eventually look like. I'm not the best at creating entire illustrations in my mind, so I let the illustration come to life piece by piece as I'm working out each individual element, testing out combinations of styles, looking at some examples of architecture and design online while I'm doing this. Anything that helps me figure out how I translate this idea and feeling in my mind onto paper. Adding shading here and there, going into details in some areas, and doing very basic shapes in others. Detail is something I generally get into in the beginning of my sketch, and once I figure out what style I'm going with, I go into more basic design and focus on finishing the sketch. Finishing the sketch and the surroundings will help you get a good visual of what the final design should look like. Finishing the second more detailed sketch, I generally get into creating the line work for my final version. When creating top-down maps, it's as simple as that. But I didn't take into account the difficulty that comes into play when working with a three-dimensional drawing. Now don't get me wrong, I've worked with vanishing points in the past, even in my top-down versions of maps, and in situations like those, you can generally just wing it. I wasn't trying to create the perfect technical drawing here, I was just trying to make a simple illustration. You can see me really struggle with taking this shortcut, trying to use a very basic hand-drawn grid to save what can be saved. Now after this futile effort in creating a complex 3D drawing by hand, without any framework, I knew there were a couple of paths I could take. The first one was using 3D software to create a quick framework of my city and then drawing over it. I hadn't used a 3D program in a long time, but I knew a couple of easy to use and more importantly free programs that could help me in my quest for creating a framework. Sketchup is one of those programs. You just have to create an account and you can start building simple 3D shapes on the fly. Now when I started doing this, I hadn't recorded it, but I will show you what I was working with here to demonstrate. It was soon that I realized that in order to create this map, I needed more than just the basic shapes I was comfortable working with jumping into a program after such a long time. So I had the choice of either learning how to use 3D software or go with another more fallible technique and save myself a lot of time in the process. If I had chosen to create a simple village map on the other hand, I think it would have been a great starting point using Sketchup. Learning to use 3D software is one of the biggest assets a designer could have in his skill set, so it's definitely something you should consider. I chose to take another route, and it is draw simple 3D shapes over my sketch in order to help me figure out the flow of my drawing. I started by creating the boundary for my housing district, building the towers and walls surrounding them. Also drawing some of the elements that weren't affected by the vanishing point in a comparable way, thus easier to wing the construction of, like parts of the mountain and the staircase that leads down from the city gates. Using a simple two-dimensional baseline grid with a vanishing point for the main district helps me map the network of streets and houses first. Basically the 2D framework for my 3D framework. I change the color by putting a color overlay on top, and then take down the opacity to make the grid blend into the boundaries I'd drawn before. Then I get to drawing basic blocks on top of the grid. You will see that it's not a perfect technique. It is very fallible, especially when you haven't had enough practice to draw these types of complex structures. It's a decision you will need to make early on. Do I want to create this map now and be confronted with the inability to do something beyond my skill, or just have fun doing something new and perhaps learn a thing or two in the process? Generally, when I feel like I'm becoming too critical of myself, I try to focus on convincing myself of the blind spots in an illustration. Like the fact that this is a mountain map, and that structures on a mountain don't all have the exact same vanishing point due to elevation. It's an odd thing to have to try to trick your brain to be happy with your work, but sometimes it helps to get on with drawing instead of constantly focusing on your shortcomings. I continue deconstructing my entire sketch like this, making sure everything feels like it makes sense. This type of deconstruction is also great to get a good grip on shading later on in the process. Learning how to deconstruct any object is a great tip for becoming a better artist. It's what you start with when you draw those first fruit baskets, and what you take with you when you draw models. Once I have finished my framework drawing, I get to flipping a couple of times to make sure the entire design is sturdy, using the liquify tool to get rid of instabilities. Now that I have both my final sketch and my framework complete, I can finally get into creating my line work. Although it will contradict what I said in my previous episode, I did choose to start on the focal point of my drawing in this attempt at getting my line work right. In the previous attempt, I started working on the lower city, as I did in my two-dimensional drawing, but here I got right to drawing the citadel or castle first. The reason for this is that when you start a do-over of a project, I like to start somewhere I hadn't gotten to in my previous attempt. It helps me start with a blank slate, and once I get to where I decided to stop last time, I will have forgotten that disgusting feeling you get when starting from scratch. You notice that while I'm doing this, I'm still struggling somewhat with the perspective of my drawing, slowly piecing the pieces of my three-dimensional puzzle together as I move along in my drawing. I'm also trying out variations of construction details, figuring out what I would like this castle to look like. Zooming in and out a lot will help you figure out what feels right. Being confronted with too much detail can make it hard on the eye to discover simple mistakes in your design. So look at it from a distance a lot, and you will figure out what exactly is straining your eye. While I'm doing all of this, I'm also testing out techniques that I have seen other artists use. Stuff that adds minor details to a drawing, like adding these little dots or scratches to the stone hands. I am constantly experimenting either minor ways like this or in more significant ways during my exercises, mimicking techniques of other creators. It's very important to have your own take on things, to make it feel like your style is unique from others. But becoming a more defined artist by understanding how others work their craft is important too. Experiment constantly. Getting back into the housing district of my design, I started by creating each house individually, and then copy-pasting some of my design into other parts of the city. It's that battle again of trying to figure out how much I will cheat in contrast with how unique I would like my illustration to look. Eventually, I got to a point where I decided that I would just copy entire blocks of my city, and just move the perspective using the tools provided in Photoshop. Liquify might not be the greatest tool. There are actual perspective tools in Photoshop, but I've grown so used to exploiting that part of Photoshop that it's become somewhat of a second nature, creating an entire fragment of my city very quickly by just copying entire slices of it in one go. Part of the reason I chose to do it like this was because I also knew that parts of this section would be obscured, and I could always decide later on in my drawing if the area needed more variation. Next part was refining my boundaries for the lower city box, drawing those towers and walls surrounding them. I use a lot of layers in circumstances like this because it makes it easy to draw something that overlaps one thing, but that might get overlapped somewhere else by another. Give your brain space to breathe and focus on creating things that look good first and fixing those mistakes second. Once the boundaries are up, you can start by erasing parts of it inside, the housing district in this case, and then you start to get a glimpse of where you think it could use more detail and where you can just leave it as it is. Another good trick is to leave it as it is at first and come back to it later. Start working on another part of your drawing and come back with a fresh look on things. Next, I wanted to create the monument dedicated to 4 unknown heroes. I had a couple of ideas in mind. I knew it would be a combination of a statue of some sort and 4 maple trees that would provide the city with some unique color. At first, I started by making a design of 4 figures carrying a stone, symbolizing their sacrifice to carry the burden of others. It was a fountain of sorts. I wasn't super happy with that first design though, and decided to start from scratch again, going with a more simplified version, a single statue that would symbolize a hero, a symbol for the valor of all unknown heroes, and then keep the 4 trees as a reference to the 4 that had saved the city. Once I had made my final decision, I didn't really dally on it for too long. Finalized the courtyard by putting in the finishing touches like the cobblestones. Once some time had passed, and I had put in more detail surrounding the lower part of my city, I took another look at the housing district and decided there were a couple of houses sticking out in my design. Houses that I had copied and looked too similar. So I turned down the opacity of the entire district and started drawing a couple of fresh houses on top to mask the fact that most of the city is copy-pasted. Once the city itself was complete, I started working on the mountain and the forest surrounding the city. Another challenge arose as I was faced with the fact that I didn't want to spend too much time working on minor details like the surrounding forest, but I couldn't leave it looking like utter crap either. I tried going for a single detailed tree and copying that over and over at first, in hopes that it would just look good enough and I would be instantly happy with the result. That wasn't the case, of course, and I started again from scratch. In my second attempt, I decided to use a sketch I had drawn earlier and just start drawing a forest on top by using the basic outline and doing everything by hand. I kept at it for a while until I realized it was both a ton of work and it still looked like complete rubbish. So I decided to delete my second attempt as well and start over for a third time. I don't really know what came over me the third time though. I think I decided that maybe I should just quickly create an entire forest with simple designs, trees looking like those ones you hang in your car to make it smell like pine wood, and that it might just turn up looking good enough without much more effort on my part. I think I was getting tired of trying and just wanted to finish the line work and be done with it. I deleted that layer too and just decided to hell with it. I'll just draw the mountain without the forest. Who needs it anyway? First I drew the river so I could have the borders for my drawing and then just put in the little effort for finishing the mountain. Done, right? I put everything to the side for a while, took a breather, and came back for a fresh start. In my fourth try, I decided to use the same concept of creating a 3D framework I had used earlier to create my city, and turn the entire forest into a bunch of basic 3D shapes. Generally, it is always a smart idea to replicate something that you used in your drawing before, and you feel has worked, to help you in creating something else in the same drawing. Continuity and all that. So I made the entire forest using this basic shape and then drawing a couple of detailed versions on top of those, copy-pasting some of them to create an entire forest that matched the rest of my drawing. After that, it was on to coloring. Using the same basic principle as in my previous drawings, filling up the drawing with a single layer until you feel like it's good enough, and then adding shading and a hue layer on top of that layer until you feel like it looks right. The only thing I added in this drawing was a background color and a texture to make the city pop a little bit more during my coloring process. Something I actually kept in my final drawing, because I felt it looked quite good like that. Well, that's it for me, folks. I hope you enjoyed the second part of my tutorial on making a city map. If you did, feel free to subscribe to my channel for more. I've also provided links to more of my work in the doobly-doo down below. Until next time.